But just when it looks like Ukraine may be gaining the upper hand in its nearly 7-month defense against invasion by Russia, Vladimir Putin makes the ultimate threat to attack the country with nuclear weapons. A successful Ukrainian counteroffensive has brought territorial gains in recent weeks. Observers have warned, though, that to assume a Ukrainian victory is around the corner is wishful thinking, especially with bitterly cold weather to contend with over the next few months. Welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Where does the prospect of nuclear attack now leave Ukraine and its people? Is this the point where NATO intervenes more directly? Accusing the West of engaging in nuclear blackmail against Russia last week, this is what President Putin said.
If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will, without doubt, use all available means to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff.
Or is it? This isn't the first time Russia has rattled its nuclear sabers at perceived enemies. What's different this time? In another sign of escalation of the conflict, President Putin has also announced a partial mobilization in Russia, compulsory conscription for military reservists. Now, this has already led to a rush for one-way tickets out of Russia in recent days. There's also the prospect of Russia cobbling together a so-called referendum in separatist enclaves of Donbass and Kherson on making them part of its federation. So what can Ukrainians and the world at large now expect from this war in the coming months? Well, joining us now to discuss this from Northamptonshire in the UK, Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. In London, Domitilla Sagramoso, Senior Lecturer in Conflict and Security at King's College London. And joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine, we have Mykola Vorobiov, Ukrainian political and military journalist. Good to have you all with us. Keir Giles, Putin, this isn't the first time that Putin has talked about the possibility of using nuclear weapons. He mentioned it early on in the conflict, but he says this time he's not bluffing. But is he?
Well, the only person that ever needs to say that he's not bluffing is a habitual bluffer. And the reason why Putin needs to interject this now is because we are so very accustomed to these nuclear threats. We've been hearing them not just in the course of this conflict, but over the last 15 years. And no, that doesn't mean that Russia is about to launch a nuclear weapon, because there are two very distinct things in play here. There's what Putin says and what Russia's state propagandists say, those frothing maniacs that you see on Russian state television, where the nuclear intimidation is constant. And then, on the other hand, there's Russia's actual nuclear doctrine, what the armed forces really think nuclear weapons are for, and when they can be used, and when actually they can be useful at all. And those are two very different things. The problem is Russia capitalizes on this excited reaction that they get every single time they threaten this, because people are focusing just on the propaganda and not on the actual doctrine and the actual military utility of using a nuclear weapon, which is a very different thing and a very different picture.
All right, we're going to play a couple of clips now. First of all, this from NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg responding to the Russian president's nuclear threat.
He knows very well that a nuclear war should never be fought and cannot be won, and it will have unprecedented consequences for Russia.
And President Biden reacted to this possibility a few days earlier.
Don't. It will change the face of war, unlike anything since World War II.
Domitilla Sagramoso, how seriously should we take these threats from Putin then?
I think we should be cautious. I think it's unlikely at the moment that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons. I think that the processes of mobilization are going to be sort of initially the main sort of emphasis of Russia, to see if with its additional manpower they can secure the areas that they already control and maybe prevent further advances by the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think that these sort of threats to maybe use nuclear weapons are primarily intended to scare the West, to deter the West from providing additional support to Ukraine. from creating concern among those who might think that Russia is almost ready to push the nuclear button and to make people think twice, maybe to create fissures within the Atlantic and the European alliance. But I think that at the moment, there isn't really a plan. He's just trying to send the message that these areas that he's trying to annex through referenda are going to be considered by Russia as part of Russian territory. But I think that we should not be deterred by his rhetoric. I think we have to continue with the policies that we have conducted so far and continue providing support to Ukraine probably more actively.
What's the view from Ukraine? Mykola, what do you think has brought on these comments from Putin this time?
Well, Chatham, I think that we have to consider this nuclear cyber rattling is pretty serious, except that there is the opportunity, the possibilities of using the nuclear weapons. It's despite its remain at the low level, but it's not zero chances, you know. And basically, in many ways, many people here in Kyiv, many people were laughing before February 24th because it was nuts just to invade the neighboring country, a full-scale invasion throughout all the regions, southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. But eventually it happened, you know. So basically, here in Kyiv, we take it seriously. Also, this is I would say, the nuclear weapons. This is the last resort for Putin, but he is it's underway right now. So basically, yesterday he declared the partial mobilization, which means actually the massive mobilization, because from the video of the footage on the ground, for example, in Russia, what we see right now, they call all males, not only some certain specialists in the military, but we see some middle-aged men, like older men, and even like some youth, like around in their early 20s. So basically, I would put this question differently. It's not whether Putin is going to use the nuclear weapons, but whether his entourage allow him to do so, because we know there is a holes in his entourage and there is some peacemakers in his circle. So basically, I wouldn't exclude this scenario. Also, of course, it's very dramatic. It will mean that probably, as Secretary Stoltenberg, he said that nobody can win the nuclear war. But I think that we are at the level of the Caribbean crisis, or maybe even worse. So basically, we should not exclude such a possibility, and we should prepare, and we should somehow, by any means, to prevent it.
I just want to point out the fact that some of our viewers may have heard, as we were just listening to Mykola there, the sound of sirens there in the background in our link to Mykola. Just a reminder, this is a war zone that an active war zone that he is speaking from, and we appreciate him in talking to us. I want to turn to Keir Giles and ask him, you said that a lot of this is about domestic consumption inside Russia. How much of it, though, is about Putin's personal standing? Because it certainly appears this is not going the way Russia had hoped, and Putin is trying to mask that. Is this his way of saying, reassuring the public that whatever's happening on the battlefield, I'm on top of this?
Well, if that's what he's trying to do, it's really not very reassuring, because the whole tenor of his speech was one of a crisis, one of the battle moving out of his control. And yes, there was a lot of positive language about how Russia is still pushing forward in Donbass. But if you take apart what he's actually saying, it's plain that it's an admission that the war has not gone Russia's way. And so Russia needs to dig deep into its reserves of manpower and of industry just to stay in the fight. And you can tell that from the nonsenses and the contradictions that are in his speech if you look at it closely. Like the fact he says Russia's only suffered just under 6,000 fatalities in its armed forces, but to replace them, they need 300,000 reservists to be called up. The speech is full of moments like that, where the real meaning actually shines through. And it seems from the reaction of Russians inside Russia, that real meaning has become very clear. That's the reason why people are running for the exits, because they do not want to be called up for a war that is being lost. Yeah,
let's talk about the military call-up then. What does it mean for people inside Russia in terms of the fact that this is kind of taking this to another level, Domitilla?
Certainly, I mean, there is a lot of concern inside Russia and Putin in particular because of the sort of the conduct of the war and the advancement of the Ukrainian armed forces. So clearly, Putin is trying to sort of make sure that there are no additional losses and that, in some way they can sort of regain the terrain that they have lost. I think that it's been very hard for many Russians and for Putin in particular to sort of realize that their armed forces are not as strong as expected, that they are actually sort of losing terrain, because there was a conviction that Russia actually was going to win this war no matter what. So they are really now trying to see and to find ways in which they can actually produce a positive result on the ground. And I think Putin has been trying to carry out this military operation without calling for full or partial mobilization. But now he has really followed more the advice of the military, who have been always calling for more effective mobilization. And this is clearly a sign that things are not going in the right direction and that they need additional support. They also have problems with equipment and training. But of course, this mobilization, will take time to produce effects because the infrastructure is not there to effectively train and equip all these armed forces, or these new sort of recruits or former reservists who are now being called to join the fight. So I think that this is a very, very precarious situation in many ways for Russia. But Putin is under very strong pressure to actually, resolve this conflict positively, especially from the sort of more nationalist quarters who've been very disappointed with the way the war has been occurring in the last month or so, and they've put a lot of pressure to sort of become much more assertive and to call for broader mobilization.
Mykola, 300,000 Russian reservists is what Putin wants to call up to fight in Ukraine. I want just let me finish. I want to ask you about that because obviously the Ukrainians have made some significant gains in the battlefield recently, but they remain far outnumbered by Russian forces, and this is a reminder of that. So what do you say to that?
Hassan, again, first and foremost, I wouldn't say that this is about the Putin, the recent. Let's start with that. So about the recent Putin speech and his call for mobilization. So let's not call it a partial mobilization. It's a full-scale mobilization, basically. So from yesterday, so the war knocked into every Russian household, basically.
All right, we're going to put up a graphic now that shows Russia's nuclear weapon threats when it comes to Ukraine. President Putin says he is not bluffing this time, but let's take a look at previous occasions where Russia threatened to use nuclear weapons over Ukraine. In February and August 2008, he warned he'd use them against his neighbors, Poland and Ukraine, if the US stationed its missiles in either country. In 2014, he warned of nuclear attacks if Ukraine attempted to retake Crimea after Russia invaded and annexed the Black Sea Peninsula in February that year. And earlier this year, Putin said that states attempting to, quote, obstruct Russia in Ukraine would suffer the consequences, implying a threat to use nuclear weapons. Let me turn back to Keir. There is a school of thought that says Putin's aim right now is to try and frighten the West into stopping supplying Ukraine with the weapons it needs to defend itself, and that this would break the link, and that way he can win. What's your view on that?
Well, I wouldn't call it a school of thought. I think it's pretty clear that that is President Putin's objective and has been for some time. He's recognized that Russia hasn't won on the battlefield. It hasn't won in Ukraine. And so it's looking for elsewhere, other places that can win this war. And obviously, the main center of gravity that he can attack is Ukraine's support. It's backing from Western countries that are supplying it with economic aid, with weapons supplies, and so on. If he can pull away that support, the reasoning goes, then Ukraine will find it far harder to resist the Russian attack. And so that's what Russia has been pushing at all this time. We've seen the grain blockades from Ukrainian ports. We've seen the energy cutoffs that have sent prices through the roof in European countries as a result of the energy spikes in costs. And now, of course, we have the intimidation as well, trying to play on the fears of Western publics and Western politicians that if they do continue to obstruct Russia, then there will be some kind of nuclear repercussion. And in particular, trying to dissuade the West from backing Ukraine in liberating those occupied territories, especially if Russia has a piece of paper to claim that they're actually part of Russia itself.
So, Mykola, with the harsh Ukrainian winter approaching, what implications is this going to have for both sides of this conflict?
The most concerning thing right now is that earlier this month, Russians struck their water supply facilities and electricity supplies in Kharkiv region. So basically, this was a clear response of the military setbacks earlier in Kharkiv. And when the Russian troops, which were actually, they outnumber Ukrainians, but they suffered the humiliating defeat, they were forced to retreat. And partially this was a response of the Russians. So they start targeting the Ukrainian, not military, but the electricity and other civilian facilities. So basically, and of course, President Zelensky earlier, he mentioned that the next 90 days of winter will be decisive, not only for Ukrainian, but also for the history of Europe. So that's why people are concerned. But, you know, Hassam, you mentioned about the nuclear cyber rattling of Putin back in 2004, back in 2014. But at this point, Ukraine, they don't have a chance. They don't have an option. There is no choice, actually, whether to fight or to not, because it's a matter of survival of Ukrainians as a state, of Ukraine as a nation, and as their statehood. So basically, in many ways, Ukrainians, whether they are scared or not, whether they don't want to turn into this, as the Russian propagandists, they call this a nuclear ash. I mean, Ukrainians don't have a choice at this point. So basically, Ukrainians are actively preparing for the winter. Ukrainian militaries are gaining some more and more winter clothes, including from the NATO countries. And Ukraine will defend its territories, and nothing can stop Ukrainian army to advance and to liberate its territories. Neither its nukes nor its call for the mobilization or attacking some civilian facilities, which makes even Ukrainians even more aggressive, even more eager to defend their country.
All right, apologies again for the less than perfect sound quality we're getting from our link to Kyiv there. Again, it is a war zone right now, but hopefully you can just about hear me okay. I want to bring up another graphic now about countries supporting Ukraine ahead of the winter. The Ukrainian counteroffensive. The United States approved $675 million in an arms package last week, adding to the $44 billion it provided to Ukraine since the outbreak of war. And UK Prime Minister Liz Truss has promised at least $2.63 billion in 2023. Domitilla, is this going to be enough?
Well, it certainly is going to help, but I think what is really important is to provide the kind of weaponry that can really hit Russia, sort of hit the Russian forces in sort of the background. So I think when we think, for example, of the so-called ATACMS, the long-range army tactical missile systems, so these could really sort of provide sort of an additional impact on all the sort of the facilities that Russia has, ammunition depots, communications. So I think what is really important is that these commitments that are made really reflect the provision of adequate equipment, also sort of air defense systems and mechanisms that can protect, Ukraine more effectively from sort of Russian advances that could materialize. So I think it is positive that there is this response, that there is this provision of equipment of artillery tanks, but it really needs to be sustained sort of in the long run, because the big question here is to what extent, what is going to happen in the winter, and to what extent are we going to keep this sort of united front in Europe if there is, for example, sort of a significant disturbances around increases in energy prices, and Putin, for example, uses the energy weapon to put pressure on European countries, and there is a sort of a break in the European front of support. So I think these are issues that we really need to monitor. I mean, what is going to happen this winter, and how, to what extent Putin is going to use a so-called energy weapon to put pressure on European countries to sort of lift sanctions, reduce support, and in some way not become so engaged anymore in supporting Ukraine, because there's pressure from the populations to maybe sort of put pressure on Ukraine to reach some kind of settlement. And I think this is something we need to be very careful and very concerned.
Keir Giles, Putin is clearly taking this to another level. Is it possible, though, that NATO may respond in kind? By that, I don't mean nuclear threats. I'm talking more about things like boots on the ground, which seemed pretty unlikely several months ago. Is it perhaps more likely now? How do you see that?
No, I don't think that's any more likely at the moment, and I can't envisage a scenario where that would actually happen. Ukraine has demonstrated very clearly that it is capable of fighting this fight with Western support, and there is no need for foreign troops to actually be present with actual formed formations from foreign militaries to be present in Ukraine over and above what was there before, the training missions which were assisting Ukraine in trying to prepare for this invasion. But when we think about what President Putin may do next, we need to bear in mind that actually he has a range of different options open. Now, Mykola's already talked about that campaign of destruction of critical infrastructure, civilian infrastructure in Ukraine itself. And that's why it's so important not only to keep up the military assistance that Domitilla was talking about just a moment ago, but also the economic and humanitarian aid as well, to keep Ukraine's economy functioning, to keep the country functioning as a state, while Russia is doing its best to destroy it out of acts of sheer destructive malice and spite, because once again they've realized that they can't actually win on the battlefield, so they're looking for other ways of defeating Ukraine, and if they can't have it, they want to destroy it.
Domitilla, the longer this conflict goes on, you see the possibility of NATO getting more directly involved?
I think that at the moment, as was mentioned by Keir, I think there isn't really a possibility that that NATO member states would become engaged with troops on the ground. I think the big question is, to what extent are they going to continue providing the necessary equipment, and the equipment they promise actually being delivered. I think that in a way, NATO is involved in terms of providing equipment, intelligence, support. And that is what really worries Russia, because in a way it is fighting with an enemy that has very strong sort of backing from NATO countries whose military technology in some sectors is quite advanced and maybe even more advanced. So I think that I'm not expecting this kind of escalation from happening. I think the Americans are very concerned about, especially President Biden, of sending sort of troops. And I think in a way, if we go back to the question of nuclear deterrence, in a way, Russia has managed to deter sort of, for example, the introduction of a no-fly zone by NATO at the start of the conflict. So, Putin has been playing with this in certain ways quite effectively. On the other hand, we've seen that, when there were attacks in Crimea, Russia actually didn't really react in the way it was saying it would react. So I think, again, that brings me to the point that we need to be not too concerned about the nuclear dimension, but what we need is resilience and a determination to continue supporting Ukraine, even if in the winter there might be some setbacks, to think that this is really too valuable for us in terms of protecting Ukrainian territorial integrity, sustaining the principles of international law, and condemning aggression, and really, punishing all these sort of crimes that we are seeing that have been carried out by Russia in Ukraine.
Okay, I want to get what's probably going to be the last word on this to Mykola. What would you want? What further assistance would you want to see from NATO to help Ukraine win this war?
We need weapons, and again weapons. So basically, on October 1st, we are expecting the Lend-Lease to take action from the United States. So Ukraine needs not only the defensive, sophisticated, modernized weapon, but also the offensive weapon right now. And recently, Ukrainians, they already proved they can conduct an effective offensive operation with the modern, using NATO tactics, of course, Ukrainian motivation, and modern Western sophisticated weapons. So basically, all we need just more to liberate all the territories of Ukraine, not of the line of February 24th or 2014, but to restore a full Ukrainian integrity, including the previously occupied Donbass and annexed Crimea. That's the ultimate goal of Ukrainian country leadership and most of the Ukrainian people.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you. Keir Giles in Northamptonshire in the UK, Domitilla Sagramoso in London, and Mykola Vorobiov in Kyiv. Thanks very much for being on Roundtable. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.